Okay, welcome everyone to our virtual open day. This is the law faculty. In front of you, you'll see the panel who are all made up of our law ambassadors, which are the Linklater Oxford Law Access Ambassadors. They're all first year students and they're here to chat to you about what you've said on the poll, which is what you want to speak about is the LNAT and the interviews, which will all be remote this year. Just a few things to point out to start off with. On YouTube, if you're watching via YouTube, you won't be able to put any questions on there. So you need to go to the Oxford website and then go onto the law page. And then there you'll see at the bottom of the screen, this video should pop up and then a question and answer bit next to it. And we've got some people that will be typing the answers to your questions there. And if anything keeps on coming up, I'll divert it to the panel here and they can talk about that as well. Okay, so over to you guys. I'm going to come off camera and I think we should maybe start with the first part, which is the LNAT. So whoever wants to go.
Yeah, maybe we could just take a quick round of introductions. So I'm Joseph. I'm a first-year law student at Wadham. Smriti, I'll go next.
Hi, I'm Smriti. I'm a first-year law student at Merton. I did the IB, so any international questions as well are welcome. Sahil?
Hi, I'm Sahil. I'm a first-year law student at St. Cat's, and yeah, I did A-levels in the UK here.
Hi, I'm Ted. I'm a first year at Lincoln and I am from the UK as well.
Yeah, great. So I think the LNAT has been quite a while for some of us, but I think it's pretty natural in my experience for people to be quite nervous about the LNAT because I think some people, it's quite hit or miss. Like personally, I didn't do very well on the LNAT. Or I know people did very, very well on the LNAT. And some people think, oh, there's a minimum score to get to Oxford and things like that. But I think just to get that out of the way, don't worry too much about the LNAT. And I think maybe if one of the rest of you would like to share a little bit about your experience preparing for the LNAT and taking the LNAT, you could jump in here.
Sure. I actually would say that the LNAT was, I think, one of the stronger parts of my application, just because one of the reasons I ended up choosing law over a lot of subjects. I ended up applying to a lot of science subjects as well, because I didn't do a lot of humanities in high school, was because I weirdly really enjoyed giving the LNAT. I loved doing all the practice tests. I loved giving the exam for some reason. That kind of close critical reading and answering and the essay questions was something that really engaged with me. And so I think one indicator of whether you are interested in law is the LNAT, but it's definitely not the only thing that matters in your application because Oxford takes a lot of time to review your application holistically. And exams are, of course, not the only criteria that determine you. But I think preparing for the LNAT, the most important thing I think for the LNAT is just practice because it's so different from some of the English reading comprehensions that you do in school. And you just need to really pay attention because the options there's not one correct option. There are a lot that feel right. And you just have to pick the most defensible position and things that you can argue throughout in the reading, essentially.
Yeah, I would add to that you don't need to worry too much if you don't like doing the LNAT because I wouldn't say that I particularly enjoy doing it. I mean, it's not exactly what I feel like the LNAT is useful in the sense that it's quite difficult. We have to accept that it's a difficult test, especially because the material they're giving you, you might not be particularly interested in it. It's going to be the questions are going to be complicated, and you're going to have to approach it pragmatically as you would any other multiple choice test, right? So you're going to have to go through. I would if I was doing it again, I would make a note of the questions I find difficult, and the two answers that I think it could be, because you can always knock off one or two and stuff like that. So if we could approach it in that way, I wouldn't worry too much if you don't like the content of what's being presented to you, because obviously I feel like a lot of it can be kind of philosophical stuff, English, literature kind of things. So if you're not interested in that, then you won't find it interesting. But I think it's a good exercise in comprehension. So if you can kind of read it and kind of grasp what you need to get out of those questions, then I feel like it's the skills that you need, but not necessarily the content, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think I didn't like the LNAT very much because they just give you on purposely quite dense text to read, and then they ask you questions they're quite ambiguous questions with quite ambiguous answers in the multiple choice, and it's a little bit frustrating. But so I don't think, sounds a bit like I'm just completely discounting what Smriti said, but I don't think I can see why it's the law test, but I wouldn't say that if you like it, you'll like law, and if you don't like it, you won't like law. And I think as far as people are quite worried, because I've done some Q&As today already, people are quite worried about how to prepare. I think the most important thing is that you just are familiar with its format. You can't really prepare for the questions themselves, because I mean, the first, it's just, as I just said, it's text with some questions and then an essay. So if you know how to write an essay, then you don't need to prepare for the second part really. And if you can read, you don't need to worry about the first part too much. It's just making sure you don't get to an exam center and think, oh my goodness, what is going on? Because that's time. Trying to familiarize yourself is time you could spend answering your questions.
Hannah has just joined us. Perhaps you want to introduce yourself to everyone on the live stream.
Sorry, hi. Can everyone hear me okay? Someone confirm. I was having big technical issues today. I'm Hannah. I'm a first year law student. I'm at Somerville College. Not much else that interesting about me, to be honest, so I'll leave it there.
I'll bring back to the LNAT. Sorry, Joseph.
Yeah, sure. I just want to add one thing about the LNAT. I think if you've never done a practice test before, I think some people have a misconception that, for example, if you're very well versed in law, you'll be better at the LNAT. But I think it's very important to remember that actually the texts within the LNAT are often not related to law itself. They tend to be either literature, philosophy, or even from science itself. So I think as Sahil and some of the rest have already mentioned, it really is a test of your comprehension skills and the ability to work within a fixed amount of time. And I think my biggest LNAT tip is really to practice, especially for the first part. And I think as Ted said, if you know how to write an essay, the second part is perhaps considering certain essay prompts, but it's not really something that you prepare as much as, for example, you can practice for the first section. But yes, Sahil, you wanted to say something.
So yeah, I would say that, I mean, it's true that it is a test of your comprehension skills, and there's not much additional practice needed, but I would definitely say that if you can get a hold of any practice tests online, I know there's I'm not going to name any services, but there's lots of services that you could look into. I would definitely try and get as much exposure to the format as possible and try to do those practice questions in time conditions. You don't want to run out of time during the test. You want to go through it, and there's plenty of time if you practice it. And with regard to the essay, obviously, again, it's essay writing skills, but what you need to do is you need to look up practice essay questions. What you can do is you can get a Word document, disable spell check, and then give yourself whatever, I think it's 40, I can't remember, 40 minutes or something. You get to write the essay, you get up to 750 words. If you're not used to typing essays, that's something that you should probably practice as well, because that's something you need to do quickly in that exam. Yeah, plan for 10 minutes, write for 30 minutes, etc.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that just in terms of, I know my school didn't have a lot of general essay writing. So if you know how to write, you can do the essay. For me, the essay was really a struggle because I felt like I had a lot of ideas, but I didn't know how to put them through. And I think what helps a lot for me, I spent a couple of months just improving how much I read generally. I started reading a lot more of the newspaper, which is something that I just reading beyond the academic level was something I'd kind of not gotten used to after the IB, because I was so used to just getting bogged down with academics. And just reading short and slightly dense articles, getting more used to pausing and really comprehending every sentence and what that really said towards the main theme of the article. That really helps, because as everyone has said, there's a lot of articles in the LNAT, and a lot of them are things that you're not going to be interested in. So just to stay motivated throughout is really a struggle. For the essay generally, I think just making sure that you have clear thoughts, that you spend the initial 5 minutes planning, and that you're not just going to ramble off, because a lot of my initial practice essays were just a complete mind map essentially of all of my thoughts. And to some extent, that's a skill that you'll have to build up even in your degree. So it's good to get a head start just by having a more centralized way of thinking and having a clear structure throughout your arguments. It's quite basic, but it's things that you may have lost touch with in the past 2 years of your high school.
Yeah, so just to build on something Sriti mentioned, I think one thing to take note about for LNAT essays is that they tend to be more argumentative as opposed to expository. And so if you're not very used to, for example, taking reasoned positions and arguing for reasoned positions in 500 to 600 words, getting that amount of practice in is something that you can really practice beforehand. So there are plenty of sample essay prompts online, and just, for instance, making bullet point essay outlines and things like that can really help you get into the gear of thinking along sort of an argumentative route. So that was something I found quite helpful for myself.
So I just wanted to address, so I'm reading a couple of questions on the Slido, and I'm going to just address two of them very quickly. So a couple of people have talked about knowing, like, the knowledge of law, relevant current law affairs. Is knowledge of law necessary before beginning? No, it's not. I wouldn't say that, and I'm not. I would hesitate to say that like current law affairs is necessary either. I mean, that's definitely not what they're looking for in terms of, like, you know, not whether like you read the newspaper or not. That might be good for your own personal interest, because if you're reading the newspaper and you're like, well, you're reading about law, like, this is boring, or maybe then you're not interested. But I'm not sure if it's necessary as part of the application to be that. Maybe it'd be helpful perhaps. And the top tips for writing SIS for essay and LNAT. So we've already talked about some of them. I feel like I've marked practice LNAT essays before. I feel like when I read an LNAT essay, what you want to look for in any essay, even when you start your degree, is you want to have a clear idea of what you're going to say, and you can get that across. And there's a very easy way to do this, right? So planning is very important. Don't rush. Like, you know, if you've got 40 minutes and you practiced it, you don't need to like start straight away. But like the easiest way to do this is just to say, like, say if like the question is, should there be compulsory voting in the UK? Like, if I'm reading your introduction and your essay, I want to like know straight away what you're saying, what your argument is going to be. So that so the first line should literally be whether you think compulsory voting, there should not be compulsory voting in the UK. Like, this essay will argue firstly this, like these two reasons, it will show these two reasons why, and then it will address like this counter argument against it, which is also an important thing you want to do. So you want to bring up arguments against, but you don't want to be sitting on the fence. You want to take a clear position, and you can like dismantle those other arguments as well. So that was my tips for above all, please just make your point of view known. I don't want to wait until your conclusion to find out what like your opinion is. It's very important. But yeah, and we'll address some of the more questions later, but I'll pass that to anyone who wants to speak now. Hey, Joseph.
I think quite a lot of what you were just saying, Sahil, was that is backed up by sort of the time limit in the exam of 40 minutes and the word limit itself. They don't want like a journal article about this particular topic. They want to know what you think, and they want to know how much you've thought about it. Because I think probably the essay is the most like what it is to study law, at least at Oxford, is that in a tutorial essay, they look for your point of view, what you have to back that up, and then some engagement with alternative points of view. And I think in 500 to 700 words, whatever the actual limit is, you don't have, you know, the space to go into any more depth than that. You've just got to lay out, and because these essays go to the universities, so you want to show how you think, how you approach the problem, how you approach the question, and then just go with it, because you also don't have time to rewrite it. For example, you need to pick, because I think it's 3 questions you pick from. You pick the one that you feel most comfortable at discussing, or the one that you feel most confident that you can structure an argument for. So I remember mine was, I had 3 choices. One was about arms sales, one was about politicians' private lives, and one was about something about euthanasia. And I did the euthanasia one because I just read a book with a chapter dedicated to that, and so I felt I could talk about that because I'd sort of, to some extent, I'd sort of seen a longer form of what I wanted to write. And so I'd say there's no set way to do it as well. You can present it sort of as Joseph was saying earlier, you can present it as like an argument, but I think there is room also to sort of construct I don't know how to put this, just construct an essay that does go through several points of view. Because I remember mine, I outlined, I think, maybe 4 different positions on it, but I stuck to an overriding theme, and I've gone way into depth because that's just my question, and you're not going to get asked that, but that's just the sort of thing you should be thinking, I think.
Yeah, it's not a test of knowledge.
Yeah, I agree with. Yeah, you go on.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to kind of jump on because I had a kind of similar experience where I saw a question on Slido, which is, how do you write for something that you were completely unprepared for, which is something that I was so scared of when I was going to give the LNAT essays, because some of the essays once you start doing practice tests, you see some of the essay questions and you have no idea. I think particularly some of the international students, when you look at questions about the UK voting system, for example, it's not something that you read about previously. It's something that you think this is where you have a significant disadvantage. And as an international student, you have so many pressures. You don't want this to be where you fail. But I would think that having of course, reading is something that you can always do, as Ted said. Just it honestly just increases your confidence to know a little bit about whatever topic you're writing. But I think if you really reflect on what you read in high school itself, I did bio and chem. So the if you do enough practice tests, you get an idea of certain topics that get tested. Often medical ethics is one that comes up quite a bit. And I did bio, so I used to take a bit of time every time I did a chapter to think about what are the ethics and morals that are behind this sort of chapter. And so when you put that as something that you're thinking about through your high school degree, it also helps a lot when you're writing the essay, just because it's something that you can fall back to in like a stressful moment. You can remember something that your teacher said or a discussion that you had in class. And if you particularly challenge friends to talk about certain issues constantly, I think that also helps in how you can structure your arguments and how confident you're in advocating for your position generally. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess perhaps to add perhaps a more practical tip, especially building on what Smriti mentioned. I think a big fear for the essay is that you don't know what will come out and you don't know what to write about. And I think especially as Smriti mentioned, I'm an international student as well. And like, which basically ruled out all the UK politic questions for me, because like I just didn't know what was going on. I didn't even know like how the system operated. But I think one thing which I found quite helpful is learning and arguing from first principles. And this will be something quite relevant when you start a law degree as well. And for instance, like familiarizing yourself with things like either, for instance, utilitarianism versus libertarianism. And these first principles, in a sense, already give you certain positions to think from different issues from, even if you might not perhaps have the best grasp on the subject matter. But I think really the biggest advice is to read as widely as you can. Yeah. I guess there are also some questions about the IB. So not sure, apart from Smriti and I, who else did the IB, but a couple of people are asking about our IB subjects. So I did history, econs, and literature at higher level, and Chinese B, math, and physics at standard level. If anybody else wants to share their combinations.
Yeah, my bio, my subjects were biochem and English Langlet at higher level, and my standard levels was psychology, math, and Hindi B. So it was mostly a science subject. So I think law is really interesting because you can do anything as long as you have some sort of essay writing subject, which the IB forces you to have. So don't worry too much about your IB subjects.
At A level, I studied maths, history, politics, and Latin. I would add that an essay subject is good for studying law, but I wouldn't say there's necessarily like it's not required, but it's just like recommended because it obviously develops the skills that you need on a law degree. But of course, you can demonstrate this in other ways if you've taken like STEM subjects and now you decide what you want to do law. It's not necessarily going to be a barrier for entry.
Yeah, I did quite a weird mix of A levels. I did politics, psychology, and maths because those were just what I was interested in doing when I picked them in year 11. So I think it doesn't really matter because law is such a broad subject. So long as you can write and you can read and just like form an opinion on things, then as everyone can, it could be suitable for you. Like it's just, yeah. I had something else to say, but it's gone. So yeah, don't stress too much about what you're doing at the moment, because so long as you can, because that's why you do the LNAT, to show that you can do these more subject specific skills. And so I think that's important to remember.
Just to jump on from that, my levels were English, maths, and Spanish. Again, quite a random combination. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I think English was useful in kind of refining my essay writing, but I don't think it was essential, which is why you're not required to have knowledge of law prior to your interview. because it's not the kind of entrance exams, and even the LNAT is not designed to test your law ability or subject specific. It's kind of just to see whether you have the skills which are transferable from so many A levels that could be applied to law. So I would say don't worry about your subjects too much.
Yeah, I'll just add on as well, saying that I think what's really interesting about whatever subjects that you take is that they have so many avenues into the law, but also there are a lot of questions on if you have to add in how your subjects are related to the law within your personal statement. I saw a lot of questions on, do you have to talk about the practicals that you did? Do you have to talk about any particular topic that you thought was really interesting? And sure, if you're doing that because that's something that actually actively increased how interested you were in the law, that absolutely you should add that in. But you shouldn't just do it because you're ticking a box and you want to explain why you took a certain subject, because those are really obvious within the personal statements. Because I get a lot of personal statements to read and review, and there's no real formula of how to get the perfect personal statement, whether you're doing the IB or whether you're doing the A levels. I think a lot of people who end up picking law just do high school subjects they're just really interested in. And as long as you use that as a launching pad for your interest in law, then that's something that's actively engaging your reader. But if you're just saying that I started doing history and therefore I'm interested in the law, is not something that's going to be interesting to read. And so you should just be cognizant of that when you're writing.
So I think that we might come back to that on that later, but we're probably moving on to like the interview experience now. And we recognize it's a tough time for everyone, especially given that we have to do the interviews online again. I've talked to my tutors about this. No one likes having to do this, and we're sorry that you didn't get that experience, because I think it is quite important. But still, I think there's certain advantages comes from having it online that we could potentially discuss. But yeah, it's right. Joseph, can you take the first part about the interview? Just introduce.
Yeah, sure. So I think one common misconception about the interview is people think that, okay, what is the Oxford Law interview like? And then they don't realize that basically every college does interviews differently, and basically your experience is completely different from, like mine is different from Sweetie's and hers is different from Sahil's, for example. And I think it's important to recognize that it's a lot about the skills that you bring to the table, your ability to think, and for instance, the potential that you demonstrate to your tutors as well. So I guess I'll cover a few common formats, but again, this will vary significantly depending on where you interview. So I think certain common formats that you might encounter at an Oxford Law interview are, for instance, a case interview for one. So in a case interview, you may be given a judgment or a piece of reading, and then you'll be given reading time, and then you will discuss either the judgment or, for instance, a piece of legislation with the tutor and the interviewer. Another common interview style is a case study interview. So this is something I experienced personally, where you are given a hypothetical situation and then you sort of debate/discuss the hypothetical with the tutor, and the hypothetical evolves as you go along based on your responses. Some other formats are a personal statement-based interview. So this will really be bouncing off ideas from the personal statement. But again, these are just three sort of common formats, but it's of course very different. And especially because this year, like last year, all interviews will be done virtually again. There may be some limitations and certain changes between how different colleges do their interviews. So if I remember correctly, interviews will last about 25 to 30 minutes per person. But of course, this may also vary by college. And within this, my personal experience was 2 tutors to 1 student. So when I was in the interview room, it was 2 of my tutors and then discussing with me personally. I guess a little bit about, apart from the nature of the interview, I think some things you might want to consider preparing. I think one, being well read on the law itself can be helpful. I think because a judgment/case-based interview is possible, learning how to reach a judgment can be a very practical and useful thing to do, and doesn't take very long, because perhaps you might end up wasting half an hour reading the arguments put forth by counsel as opposed to the judgment itself, and that could be a bit problematic. But I guess I'll open the floor to anybody else who wanted to add about either the nature of the interview or share a bit about how you prepared for the interview.
Yeah, I can do a bit, because you mentioned case-based interviews. I had a case-based interview, and I had no support from my school. We had a number of mock interviews in my school, and all of them were about my personality, my fit with the college, and how much I like the law. And those are not questions you're going to be asked at all. It's a lot more academic, which I think is quite good. And case-based particularly, unlike, I wish I'd had Joseph when I was preparing, because I had not read a single case before. I was so stressed. The first 40 minutes of reading was just absolute hell for me. But this is where I think the reading that you do in the LNAT help a lot, just because you get used to just consuming a lot of dense information. And I think the most important thing for the interview is just to honestly remain calm when you need time, take time, because I had a remote interview. I had, now you'll have usually 2 interviews per college. I only had 1 interview, and so that extended. And one of the real positives of the online interview format is that I'm quite a fidgety person. So I would take the time to drink my water. I would need to move around a bit within the space, which they allowed me to do because it was mostly online. And I think just doing what you can to cope with the environment is super important, because you want to show your best self, and the interviewers want you to show your best self because they're actually really looking forward to teaching you in the future. And both my tutors are tutors that I had, and they just want to see how you can think through things. And one of the main pieces of advice I got was stick to a position and then do not move from that position at all. This is something that really psyched me out, because I don't know if I had the confidence to do that. And especially when you're reading something as dense as a case or a statute, for example, it's really difficult to stick to positions because you have no idea what you're saying, really. And I would just advise you as much as possible to think through what you're saying, but if you make a real mistake and you're aware and take a bit of a third party approach to what the ramble that's going on in those 5 minutes of what you're saying, and you realize this is something that doesn't really make sense with everything else I've said. It's totally normal and okay for you to say that, okay, this no longer works, especially when your interviewers will push back, and to explain why it no longer works. Don't just give up, but do explain why you've had changes in your thought process throughout, because that's what tutorials are like. And interviews are actually a really good example of what you'll have to do day in and day out in an Oxford degree. And it's a good indicator, I think, of whether you like being challenged in the way that tutorials do. If anyone else wants to speak on that.
Yeah, I'll speak on 2 things. So firstly, I want to talk about what the attitude to the interview. And I think that it's easiest for us to say, we've been through it now and it's a long time away for us, but I think the best attitude to go into the interview, it's very stressful, and you just want to take the opportunity to have a meaningful conversation with someone who's going to be a world leading expert in law. It's just treat it as try and treat it as a friendly conversation. Like Smithy said, like it's going to be, these people are going to be teaching you for 3 years, so that you want to put yourself out there as someone they want to teach and get to know, because we'll talk about this later, but they're going to get to know you very well. So that's what they're looking for. They're looking for people that they want to teach. So just try and make it a friendly conversation. You're back and forth. That's what the best interviews are going to be like. And now with this argumentative side of it, I mean, like, pick a side. Don't try not to sit on the fence. Try and explain your thought process. Concede if necessary. So please try not to be afraid to have your ideas challenged and questions, because they will be. It doesn't matter how good the point you're going to make. Like, I'm sure that everyone watching this knows that in this kind of subject, there's no right answer, right? So whatever position you take, no matter how impressed they are, they're going to come back at you, and you're going to be challenged. So try and deal with that as best as you can. If they start pushing your argument to the point where it doesn't make sense, then don't just stick to it blindly. Keep pushing on it, concede if you need to. And I would say that is that's what we're going to try and do, is try and treat it as like a conversation as best as you can. And I think that will help it a lot. I want also sorry, I forgot what I was going to say. I'll come back to you in a minute.
I think
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to basically reiterate the same points. So I did 2 interviews at Somerville, and one was it was a hypothetical. I had 20 minutes to read it, had to grasp it. It was the most confusing hypothetical you will ever come across, and it was just designed to kind of throw you in a way. There were so many things in that situation that just didn't make sense. But it's like, stay calm, read through it, process as much as you can. You're not meant to understand the whole thing. It would kind of defeat the purpose of it being an Oxford interview. And then on the sitting on the fence point, I actually was guilty of that in my interview. There was a point I didn't understand, and I didn't even realize I was sitting on the fence. And even if you try that approach, you will just be forced to come off it. Like the tutor kind of pushed me until I gave an answer, which ended up being right. But that shows that they're not wanting to catch you out or embarrass you. The idea of it is to kind of coax an answer out of you, even if you don't have one, which is why if you don't know the answer or you feel like you've made a mistake, don't panic. The whole idea of a tutorial-based system is that by the end of the conversation, you should have come out with more knowledge than you went in. And you're not going to do that if you have a point at the beginning and it's the same point at the end and it hasn't been challenged and you hadn't had to think about it. So yeah, basically everything that Sahil said, like if you've got a point and you think it's great, it will be challenged. Be willing to see the other side and acknowledge that that might be even an even better point, or it will help you refine your own. And yeah, they're kind of there to push you in ways that you wouldn't think possible, in terms of they'll ask you some questions that you might not have the answer to off the bat, and that is okay. And then in terms of other tips and to prepare for it, wider reading, as Smriti said, is a good idea. The only thing I would be careful of is I was kind of advised before my interview that if you do have prior knowledge and you're given a hypothetical, be careful you're not forcefully applying your own reading to a situation that it doesn't apply, or even if they specifically said this doesn't apply. It's quite easy to try and show off what you know, but if they've said that don't apply any previous knowledge, you will end up kind of shooting yourself in the foot in a way, because you're not following the instruction. And obviously in law, it's really important to read what you're reading carefully and kind of absorb it. So yeah, they'd be my main 2 points. Ted, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. So I think we all had quite different interview experiences, which is quite good. So I had 2 interviews as well, but they were both based on statute law. So I had 40 minutes before each to read this piece of legislation, and so the first one, they gave me 3 sort of mini scenarios to apply this law to, but obviously it wasn't like there wasn't an answer, because that would be too easy. There's sort of, it was, as everyone's been saying, it was a pick a point of view and try and argue it. And then my second one was a different statute, and then like a long scenario, like one scenario to talk about for half an hour. And I think at my college, they on purposely did like a good cop, bad cop interview, because I came out of my first one feeling like I just won Oxford, basically. Because I got into a bit of an argument with one of the tutors, and then the other one intervened and said I was right. So I was like, yes, I'm in. And then the second one, it was like, because one of my tutors is German, and so he's got the German frankness that you'd expect. And I was completely lost. I was like, oh my god, I've completely lost it now. Because they do it on, even if you have read around the subject, they'll put effort into making sure that you don't know about this in advance. Like mine were on like trust law and company law, and obviously those are very technical aspects, technical areas of law. And so I think, yeah, the most important thing is to remember that they don't expect you to know anything except what you've just read. So if you can see they're pushing you towards something, don't push back. I think the most important thing is although it's important to stick to your original point of view, I think it's more important not to be stupid about it, and not try and stick to something against all the evidence, because law is about reasoning, and if you can't reason to a logical conclusion, then you're stuck. And I think I'll just quickly move because there's some questions coming in. I think so I think tips on what not to do in interviews. As I've just said, the most important one is to not stick blindly to a point you're making when it doesn't make sense anymore. I think it's easier. There aren't many things that you can't do. I think it's more important there's some general things that you can stick to, which will probably give you an easier ride. I think one of those things would be to take a moment to think. Like, although it's like a conversation, there's nothing wrong with taking, say, like 10, 15, maybe even like 30 seconds to think quickly about what they're asking you, because as I've been saying, you don't know anything about the area yet, so you need time to think. But I think as well, something to keep in mind, I've just gone back to what I was saying before, I've gone off the question, but I just remembered to say that, and I've forgotten what to say again, so I'll just shut up.
I guess I'll quickly jump in here. I think echoing something Ted mentioned, don't approach the interview as if it's something you can prepare in its entirety, because that defeats the purpose. And to illustrate, my first interview was on unjust enrichment, which is not even in the Oxford Law syllabus. And my second interview was on a piece of like a code, a rule from the Bar Standards Board's BSB handbook, which again is not in the Oxford Law syllabus. So I think I'm trying to answer the question regarding what not to do at the interview. I think my two tips on what not to do, they play into each other. One, don't dogmatically defend your point to absurdity. So the thing is that you may come with a specific argument, you may come to a discussion with a perspective, but you must be able to accept that you may be wrong. And I think a big part of the Oxford Law tutorial system is accepting that you know very little and learning from that discourse. And if you come into the interview process thinking that, like, holding a very narrow-minded sort of view and refusing to take into account what information your tutor and interviewer feeds you, that can go very badly. But at the same time, don't take everything the tutor or interviewer says as the gospel, because sometimes they say certain things to see whether you are able to A, defend your position, and B, distinguish different points of view. So sometimes your interviewer will give you a position that sounds very similar, but on principle or on a very specific piece of fact is incredibly distinguishable from the position you've just argued. And they want to see whether you're able to identify that. So just to recap, one, don't hold your position to the death, especially if it's going down the path of absurdity. And two, at the same time, while you evaluate critically what information you're being fed by the tutors, don't necessarily take everything they say as the gospel. Yeah. So if there's anything else anyone wants to add.
I completely agree with. Sorry, I'll go for it.
Are you sure? All right.
Yeah.
I just want to quickly run through something. I just want to say about preparation for the interview. It says someone's asked, is there any way to prepare for the interview other than going over typical questions asked in the interview? I mean, yeah, because like we've talked about, they're going to make it very difficult on purpose. So like they're going to make it very deliberately, so like you don't it's very difficult to prepare for. Yes, you can do that. You can know your personal statement just in case, because I didn't get asked. Like they brought us all into a room and said, we're not going to ask you about your personal statement, but I know people that were. And if you don't know that, that's like rule one. Like you need to know what you said. Like if you read a book, at least know what happened, etc. Yeah, like the basic questions, why law, why Oxford, but you might not get asked these because they might just take you straight into that exercise because they don't have a lot of time. Bear in mind the amount of people they're interviewing. And yeah, there's not much you can do in that regard. And I wanted to address something because I hear this a lot, and it's true that the interview is kind of like a tutorial, but also I find that like it's not in the preparation sense, because don't be worried. Like you might find the interview very difficult, and I think that it's designed to be that way. But with a tutorial, like I've never found them to be the same as the interview in the sense that the arguments of the skills are still there. Like they're still going to take your points of view. We're going to discuss your points of view. But the interview is very much like at least in my case, it was much like here's 30 minutes to read something. Like try and understand what it means, have a point of view about it. Whereas in the tutorial you have like a week, so you actually like interview. Like for my first interview, like it got to a point where I had no idea what was happening, right? And that if you've read in a week for a tutorial and have done the essay and you've done the reading, that won't happen in the tutorial. So I feel like there is some kind of difference there with the preparation. So it's about like kind of working under pressure and understanding, like, you know, in that regard, basically.
Okay. Yeah, so just to go back to the tips not to do, basically, I completely agree with what Joseph said. Kind of similar to what Sal was saying about it being tutorial style. I would say it's going to sound really odd, but a tip might be to not view it as an interview in the sense of like a job interview. The idea is it's meant to be an academic conversation. So if you actually view it as you're just talking, you're getting the opportunity to talk to an expert in their field about something that you don't know. And ideally, you're going to come out knowing something that you might not have known when you were going in. If you view it as that kind of conversation approach, this wasn't a tip I was given by a third year, it kind of takes the pressure off of it in terms of you don't feel as formal, and that you have to be something that you're not. It's very much an open flowing conversation. So in that sense, it does kind of mimic the tutorial structure, and that would be a way to look at it in a way that will kind of calm your nerves. And the other thing is, don't panic. It sounds very obvious, but a big part of any kind of legal reading, like I said, mine was hypothetical, is if I were to panic at how complicated it was, it's going to make it even harder to be able to go through it, because you're just going to be focusing on how stressed you are. So take a deep breath, remember that it's just a conversation. Don't view it as like a once in a lifetime interview for a really prestigious job, because it's only going to make you more nervous. And on the personal statement point, most law students that I've spoken to weren't asked. I was. I mentioned 3 cases in my personal statement, and I was asked about 2 of them, and 2 of them were actually directly relevant to my second interview, so they came up throughout the half an hour. So if you have mentioned something on your personal statement, please make sure you have read it. I would have been in a bad spot if I hadn't read that case, because the person who was asking me knew a lot about it. That's not to say that you have to know the ins and outs of everything you've written, but you've got to show you had a genuine interest in what you mentioned, and the fact that you've actually written it. Actually read it, because if you haven't, it will just be so visible. And just another question that I got asked, I don't know if there's anyone here who took a gap year. I did. There is a stigma that gap year students aren't as favored. It's not a thing, but I was asked what I did on that gap year, so that might be a question to prepare for, in terms of, obviously they're looking for any interest in the law that you've shown in the year you've taken out, so that might be something to consider.
Yeah, I'll kind of go on that, as well as particularly the question that we've got about how a lot of the interviews and interviewers, the samples that you see are of a very specific background, a very privileged background, and that's not necessarily something that might reflect you. And that's something I was actually quite concerned about, mostly because a lot of the coaching that I received from my school was about how I spoke, my accent, how clear my enunciation was. Things, it really felt like finishing school more than interview prep. And that's absolutely not something you have to worry about at all, which is something I was so glad for as soon as the interview started, because Oxford is really looking for diversity. And one of the questions that I got in my interview at the end was a quite general question, very different in tone to what we had done for the past 25 to 30 minutes, which is, how would you change the law? And when I've talked to my tutors now, they say that that's a small way that they ask you to acknowledge your background, and they ask you to reflect about why you're here. And if there's any questions like those which allow you to give an insight into why your background and why you as an individual have something to add to the university, I think that's honestly more than anyone could ask of you as a high school student. You don't have to worry about looking a certain way, dressing really properly, really formally. I know a lot of people were thinking of, you have to wear a very proper suit to be able to even consider Oxford material, and there's no such thing. You just have to be comfortable, and you just have to be aware of where you come from. And that's sort of all. You just don't be stressed about those kind of things, because there's enough, honestly, in your head. And other don'ts, I would say, is learn from my mistakes, because I made so many mistakes during my interviews. One of the big ones was I knew that at the end they would ask if I had any questions, and so I'd come in with a list of questions prepared about my specific college, and those are things that I'd researched in the bus on the way to my interview room. And I would highly recommend that you not do that. That's, again, a stressor that you do not need. And they kind of can differentiate the difference between a question that you're asking just to flatter them and a question where you're really interested in. And I think finally, I would just say, kind of back to something that Joseph was talking about, which is first principles. If you're someone like me who really just likes feeling prepared, if you have the time, then something that I did, which I really liked applying in my interviews, was before I thought through a lot of moral dilemmas. I used to get tiny books, or I would look through the internet, and I would look back to the distinctions between very similar sounding cases. What's the difference between certain words that judgment is using, or what are the first principles, acts versus omissions, really simple things about how far can you stretch a certain idea. And if you can do that, then that's great. If not, then I'd suggest just honestly thinking through the different situations in which what you're saying will apply, and that's good enough. That's all I've got to say.
Yeah, I guess I just jump in here to emphasize two don'ts. So I think both Smriti and Hannah have already mentioned this. But first, don't panic, and two, don't worry about like unnecessary things. So I think firstly on not panicking, this may sound a bit counterintuitive, but for I think those of you on the panel may empathize with this a little bit. But try to have fun in the interview in a sense that ultimately you are given the opportunity to engage for 30 minutes, for example, with, for instance, a world leader in the field. For example, one of my interviewers who is my tort law tutor now is like the convener of Oxford Law's like tort department and is now a global fellow at Yale, for example. And like these are opportunities for you to engage about a subject that you're passionate about, that you're interested in. That's why you're applying to this subject in the first place. So don't panic. And on that note also, I think something that hasn't been mentioned, but I think is a very, very big tip that I always tell my juniors and things like that is because you want to approach the interview like a conversation, remember to think out loud. So sometimes your tutors aren't as concerned with the end product. They're concerned with how you think and how you get to the end product. So if you are able to apply principles, distinguish facts, consider scenarios, circumstances, context, but you end at the wrong answer, that could very well be much better than somebody who just jumps to the right answer, but cannot justify anything. And not panicking and treating it like a conversation was very useful to me. I think the second thing about don't worry about unnecessary things. So some people, like I was very concerned about what to wear to the interview, for example. And some people are quite concerned with that and things like what questions to ask. So like my tutors were very nice about it. At the end of the interview, they said that we will not take into consideration like we will not assess you based on the questions you ask. And if you think they weren't serious, right? I asked them, do you have tourist recommendations for places to visit in Oxford? Like that's what I asked my tutors. So like really don't worry too much about it. Ask something you're genuinely interested about. And if you don't have a question, don't worry about it. Just say like, thank you very much for your time. Yeah, so I think there's two more don'ts I'd add on.
I'd also just jump in about the can we expect more diversity from tutors point. I know a lot of my friends who got interviewed from the current dean of the law faculty, Mindy Chen Bichette, and you definitely, I think there is really a push to increase diversity, not only in the people who are interviewing you, but in the kind of questions they ask, just to ensure that you feel comfortable. But I think what's super important is that where you come from is really a strength, because I had no idea of anything related to the British legal system. I thought a lot of the preparation was reading about the legal system itself, which is again something that really bogs you down. I would think as summer reading, I would recommend doing that, but as something to stress about as quick notes right before you enter the interview room, big no, it's just going to be such a headache. And so I was a bit more used to the Indian and Singapore legal system, which is where I'm from. And so I was a bit more used to what the priorities for that legal system are. And naturally, different cultures will have slightly different approaches to problems. And just being slightly more aware of that and why someone may decide the way they do is something that'll come naturally to you if you're paying attention to kind of politics, econs around you. And just being cognizant of that is enough. That's all I have on diversity, if we want to move on from that.
Yeah, I guess just taking a new question on the slide though. So somebody has asked, how much of pro bono / work experience should one mention in the personal statement? So for me personally, I had no legal internships or legal work experience, like strictly speaking, right when I wrote my personal statement. So I wouldn't really worry too much if you, for example, have not had the opportunity to do that. But really it's about taking what you've already done, the subjects you've done, your co-curricular activities, and pulling that out into your interests and passion for the subject. Yeah. Okay, perhaps if nobody else wants to add anything, if anyone wants to add anything else about the interview, you can jump in now. If not, perhaps we can move to the structure of the degree and workload after college selection. Okay, perhaps let's start with the structure of the, Smriti, do you want to add something? Yeah.
No, I just thought we could start with the structure of the degree, because I think it's something that makes Oxford quite different and something that you should consider when you're considering Oxford versus Cambridge. Oxford versus maybe a more practical hands-on sort of course, because we have fewer choices, and some of our choices are very interesting and very unique. So for example, in our first year, we do a Roman introduction to private law, and that's our only first year private law subject before we do our moderations. And that's something only Cambridge and ourselves do. So it's something that you cannot talk to friends about. But you really have to think about whether that fits for you. Something that's really interesting about law in Oxford is that the first year, before your moderations, you have a sort of taste of the different sectors of law. You do constitutional law, which is a public law subject. You do criminal law, and you do a Roman introduction to private law. And for a lot of that, you have no idea why you're learning some of the things that you're doing. But then finally, you get to learning contract and tort, and you realize there's really a historic foundation to a lot of the content here. And so it's just an academic focus, and being aware of the examination process as well, I would say, is super important, because that's something that Oxford is on an extreme for. Oxford does moderations at the end of the first 2 terms, but they don't count towards the end of your degree. The only thing that really counts is your final exams, which you sit 9 modules through 3 weeks according to your course selection. And it can be really intense for some people. It's all of everything that counts crunched into 3 weeks of your entire degree, versus some other people. Cambridge does every year, and there are other schools that do every semester. And so just thinking through what kind of exam process works best for you. I know my tutors really like the Oxford system, which is not always a popular opinion, just because they think that your thought process evolves with the person you are. If you just think of who you are in year 12 versus year 11, an essay that you would write in those 2 years, it would be such a vast jump in terms of maturity. And that's the same that tutors think in terms of your legal course. The essays that you're submitting on contract now are very different from after you've got the full picture of the law. And so just thinking through if that's the kind of examination system that works well for you, if anyone has anything to add on that.
No, I think that's right. I think that's great. I mean, like this is one of those things where like people are very hesitant to apply to Oxford. They think that it's not for them, and there's a very many problems with that view. I mean, like as we've discussed, but like this is one thing where like if you don't like the way the Oxford degree is structured, like compared to Cambridge, for example, choosing between the two, this is a valid reason to like not want to come here. But it's also a valid reason to come here as well, because I like that we. Oh, sorry. Anyone hear me? Everyone good? Yeah. So I like that. I like that we have those exams after the first 2 terms, and then you still work hard, of course, during the second year, but you get more time to like develop your thoughts without having to worry about the exam in the second year. And at the end, of course, there's a lot of stress at the end, but that's just a personal preference, of course. And I'm just going to move on to the workload briefly. So I think this is a common question as well, and it's the standard workload, I believe, is 3 essays every fortnight. And each essay will correspond, or problem question rather, will correspond with the written work. It will correspond to a tutorial of like 1 hour, 1.5 hours, like 2-on-1, 1-on-1, 3-on-1 with a professor. So that's a lot to anyone that comes to Oxford at first, and it takes some adjusting to. But once you get into the swing of things, trust me, you get very used to it. It's just about that initial thing, and it helps that I think that like it's typed. You know what I mean? It's just about, for me personally, I'm going to go in my personal way of managing the workload. I feel it's very important to kind of, it's not that actually that the workload is of course more intense than other universities, but it's not actually that like so awful to stay on top of it. You just need to have a plan and be organized. You need to say, like, for example, what I would do is I have the reading list, and I would be like, okay, I'm going to do this today, that tomorrow, that Wednesday, Thursday I'm going to write the essay, Friday it's due. So if you do that and you stick to that, then you won't have any problems, right? The problem comes when like you just leave everything till the end, and that's when everyone has this kind of situation before, right? Because unexpected things happen, but you want to minimize that as much as possible. And if you do that and you treat Oxford like some kind of like job where you're working for the right amount of time each day and consistently, then you won't have any problems with the workload. This is what separates Oxford from other universities. It's the best place to study law in that sense. You get that personal exposure, that feedback on your essays, but it's not that. The academic demands are of course high, but it's the consistency that makes it difficult to stick with, and that's where it's going to need to come, because it's going to be 8 weeks where you're going to need to like be focused and stick to that, and like there's stuff expected of you, like you can't not do the essay, right? Because then you can't go to the tutorial, and then you're not doing the degree. So, but like this is not something to be daunted by. It's just you need to just get through that, hammer through those. You won't, I don't think at other universities you'll get that like weekly kind of expectation to do this. And you know what I mean? It's very much like kind of like a semester kind of assignment kind of thing. So this is what makes the Oxford degree kind of a bit more difficult, but also it's the best way to study law. So if you hit that I think like that's just my opinion, of course. But yeah, I'll open up.
Just following on from that, my workload is very much what Sahil just described. But I just want to add in that if there are reasons that you can't maintain it, or there's something going on a particular week, from my own experience, the tutors aren't as rigid as you would expect. They understand that the workload is heavy, and there are things that come up on a week-by-week basis that might mean that you can't do as much. So I wouldn't say rely on this, but I wouldn't feel worried that the workload is so much and they're not understanding as to you might not be able to do it one week. So in terms of if there are like any kind of issues personally, the tutors are open enough for you to discuss that and arrange maybe an extension or a lighter workload. So everyone there is there to help. And you'll often find that the students in the years above are also really helpful in that sense. If you do find that you do come here and you thought that you could handle it, but it feels like too much, for me, that was it for me for my first few weeks. I just couldn't get to grips with having that much work. I would say use the older years, speak to your tutors. You also, I don't know if it's the same in all colleges, I assume it is. In my college, you're assigned a personal tutor who is often not someone who teaches you, but you can talk to them. So there are definitely mechanisms in place, because the university does acknowledge that they push you very, very hard, but they also accommodate in ways that will allow it to be more comfortable for you if you need it. So just bear that in mind.
Just to jump in here with some more things about the structure that might be useful to take note of. So in Oxford, for our third year, we get to choose two options. So other universities, for example, Cambridge, you get to slightly more flexibility in the number of papers and what papers you choose. Whether you like this or not is up to you in terms of personal preference. And I think Sahil mentioned something about the nature of the work itself. So basically, all the work you expect to get at Oxford is essay-based. So it's either an essay prompt or a problem question. There are certain other universities who do, for example, MCQ exam papers. Oxford doesn't have that. So if you feel like essays might not be the best way you learn, then this might not necessarily be the best approach. And I think, make no mistake, I think 3 people have already mentioned that the workload is heavy. Some colleges are a little bit more brutal than others at the start. For example, my college in Michaelmas, on my very first term, we had 2 essays and 2 tutorials a week. So that was something to get used to, but it tends to average out, and most colleges do 1.5 subjects per term for the 3 months term. So I think the 3 weeks per fortnight thing is quite accurate. Another thing to take note is that jurisprudence is a compulsory subject at Oxford. It's not compulsory at, I think, most other universities. The thing about juris is that it's examined using a half of your grade for juris is in an extended essay you do at the end of your second year. So that's your only like formal assessment of sorts in second year. And then you do a half paper for finals in your third year. I think one more thing to mention, I'm not sure if anybody here is on law and European law, I'm not, but Oxford offers a course 2, which is a 4-year program where you do 1 year abroad, studying a European law in a different country. Yep. So I think the most common ones are, for example, Spanish law, French law, German law, Italian law. So yeah, I think those are some of the structural things to take note about the degree itself.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just add in, of course, if you're doing law with European law, again, I don't do it, but I've got a couple of friends who do. You do need to, that does have language requirements that you should look into. And you will need to keep in touch with that language throughout, because it's a whole year that you're spending somewhere else. I think also with the workload, I honestly would contest that we work harder than everyone else. I think we just have lesser time to work. So we just crunch all of our brain power into 8 weeks. And that just feels really stressful. And I think, as Hannah was saying, the tutors are so aware, because they see this every year, that there are people who struggled, and I struggled so hard in my first term. And I am someone who, honestly, I was moving to another country. My immune system was completely compromised. I was sick for a solid week and a half. Thankfully not COVID, but it was not a good situation. And you do have a support system, not only your friends who are suffering with you, but you also have a DOS. We call them Dean of Studies, the person who's in charge of your studies, but not directly tutoring you. If you have, for example, a tutor's style of teaching that's not a perfect fit for you, you have people to talk to. If you have some mitigating circumstances, which is why you can't get 2.5 essays done because of some random issue in 1 week, then you can talk to people and get that reduced. just because it's really understandable what you're going through in 8 weeks. A perfect 8 weeks is very, very rare. And one of the best advice pieces that I got from a BCL student was to take a weekend off every week, which is really hard to do, and I get really mocked for advocating this. But I do believe that you should either take an afternoon off, or if you're really capable, if you're having a brilliant week, then get a day off, because it's so necessary for your mental health to just look and have just a good library day out, or go to a museum, or just have a good day in one of the best beautiful cities of the world. And just take care of yourself, because that's something that's really necessary when you come to Oxford.
So I just wanted to add, with the law of European law, you don't. There's one of them is law. It's actually like, it's called law of law studies in Europe, but then there's one possible option there, law of European law, where you don't. I think you study in the Netherlands, where you don't need a language to do it. But bear in mind, obviously, this can be more competitive to get into than the regular law degree, and you can look on the Oxford Law website for details of that. And sorry, in fact, I wanted to come back to earlier. Thank you, Hannah, for coming in with that. Yeah, it's very, like, while planning is important, if you let your tutors know in like decent time that you can't do something, I've never had any problems with getting something. It's just about being polite and, like, you know, please may I have an extension, or like something's come up. They're very understanding in that regard, because obviously no one's perfect. No one can get everything done, especially with this workload as well. So yeah, it's always flexible and adjustable if you need it. And I'm sure like you'll get used to it as well.
Yeah, I'll just mention before we wrap up about colleges. The I think really good thing about all Oxford degrees, particularly law, it's very faculty based. So a lot of your learning, a lot of your lectures, a lot of the basic standard that's held for you is faculty based. So you'll get amazing tutors from all colleges. So you're not really committing to a lower standard because you're not getting into your first choice college. That's not how it works. And you'll be good wherever you go. So don't worry too much about college selection. College selection is really more about what environment you want to live in rather than your degree. So.
Brilliant. And I'll cut you off there, guys. Thank you so much for all of your help in answering everyone's questions. If anyone's watching today and there was a question that didn't get answered, or you have a think about it overnight and you have some more questions, then you're in luck, because we're back tomorrow. Different panel, slightly different panel, but we'll be back same time tomorrow to answer more questions. I hope it's been informative, and I hope to see your applications come in soon.